A few years ago, if you asked somebody the question, what's PlayStation's mascot, you'd probably get a ton of different answers. Crash Bandicoot would likely have come up, having been there since the original PlayStation, but considering he went missing for a solid decade in between the original run of Crash games and the new resurgence of them, plus the fact that the IP is now held by Activision, I don't know if he's the strongest candidate. A few later characters like Spyro and Jak and Daxter have the same problem. I think Kratos is a decent contender, seeing as how he's been around for 4 generations now. He was part of defining each of those generations, and his character really shows how PlayStation titles have evolved and matured over time, but I don't know if he can really give the mascot vibe that some of these other characters do. And Nathan Drake is a good intersection between the goofy, campy stuff and the more serious character and story-driven side of PlayStation, but he doesn't have the same tenure or possibility of return as the others. For a long time, these characters and a bunch more have been a bit of a collective mascot for Sony, and that kind of works. For over a decade, PlayStation has gone out of its way to define itself off of its breadth of quality IPs and characters rather than focusing on a single one. That even being reflected on its Marvel-esque PS Studios opening, and even though internally some executives seem hell-bent on insisting that PlayStation has no IPs, most consumers would beg to differ. But still, it's always nice to have a face and central character if you're a game company, your very own personal Mario who is your brand in a sense. And even though multiple publishers, Sony included, have tried to cook up their own Mario plenty of times, with Crash, with Spyro, with Sackboy even, no one could really replicate the organic quality that Nintendo found, because in order to capture that, you almost had to find your character by accident. Which is how we get to the Playroom. The Playroom was a small assortment of mini-games packed in with the PS4 at launch that basically showed off the new features of the PS4 controller and PlayStation camera. It was really just a tech demo that was meant to draw attention to the new features, but it was also the first time we ever saw the design of Astrobot, a helpful little recurring character that would pop up here and there over the course of the PS4 generation. At this point though, none of them had the title of Astrobot. Instead, they were just a big, homogenous group of AR bots. While the Playroom can hardly be considered a true console game, it does lay down some of the roots for the experiences to follow, like how it establishes that all the bots live inside the PlayStation controller right under the touchpad, and features a green alien side character who flies around in a UFO leaving behind ectoplasm and destruction wherever it goes. The game made almost, no impression on most players, seeing as how the PlayStation camera wasn't a popular accessory, most people could figure out how the controller worked by themselves, and the game aspect of the Playroom was essentially just a couple of AR experiments and Subway Surfers, but the follow-up 3 years later, the Playroom VR, was actually a lot more notable. It served mostly the same purpose as the original Playroom, but this time for VR. You can tell that because of the subtle hints in the marketing and the few Easter eggs on the cover. The Playroom VR was much more fleshed out and a lot more essential to the hardware it was tied to, because playing VR has a much steeper learning curve for most people than just playing on console. Once again, the AR bots served more as disposable side characters in most of the mini-games, also appearing on loading screens to give you small tips. But they were now more than just a generic blob of bots. A bunch of them had their own personalities and outfits. This game further established the bot characters as essentially PlayStation's little explainer dudes, almost like their version of Clippy. But just like the original Playroom, it establishes a few recurring ideas for the future of the franchise. The level select screen is more interactive, with small world icons representing the different mini-games. There's some light genre bending with the settings and themes of each game, everything from old westerns to spooky Ghostbuster adventures. There's a gacha minigame that lets you decorate a small room with toys and bots. There's a game where you escape from a large monster who is wearing a PlayStation VR, setting up the future of the large boss battles and making the peripherals a part of the greater Astrobot universe. And most importantly, one of the minigames, Robot Rescue, was a full 3D platformer level where you went around saving different bots who were stuck in strange places with the help of special tools tucked away in your controller. Most people considered it to be the best game in the bundle, with Simon Fitzgerald of Push Square even saying it was a standout experience that you'll wish was a fully fledged game in itself. So they made it a fully fledged game in itself. 2 years after the Playroom VR came Astrobot Rescue Mission, a PlayStation VR exclusive that to this day is one of the best experiences the PSVR scene has to offer. Rescue Mission was the first time Astrobot was established as a real character by himself, the actual lead of a game instead of just a character design that showed up when PlayStation needed to explain how their archaic motion controllers that were discovered in a cave off the coast of Ecuador in 1556 worked. And if you never had a PSVR headset and didn't play this thing, you might be surprised at how much DNA it shares with the 2024 game. And I don't just mean the general idea behind it, that's a given, but certain levels and worlds in the new game are almost ripped right out of Rescue Mission. Even ideas like the giant beanstalk and bosses like Wally Warbles and Octodad are seen here before they ever made it to the main console, albeit not nearly as fleshed out and polished. Being a VR game though, there are definitely some quirks that make this a fun entry to go back to despite the simpler design. For example, you have to actually physically look around to find bots sometimes, and the special upgrades you get are usually tied to your controller, so you kind of become a companion to your own main character through the hardware you use to interact with him. It's pretty cool. Even though this was the first game that really acknowledged his existence as a real character, by the time it came out, the idea of Astrobot had been around for 5 years already, and just 2 years later, his popularity grew even further with the release of Astro's Playroom. These names aren't confusing at all. Astro's Playroom was a built-in tech demo to show off the PS5's features in the same way that the original Playroom was meant to be for the PS4, only this time, PlayStation wasn't farting around. Instead of giving us Temple Run with robots and then a bunch of AR mumbo-jumbo, Astro's Playroom was a genuine platformer, although granted, one that was pretty short and limited in scope. Its celebration of PlayStation and the cheeky references to the PS5's hardware and how special and groundbreaking it was really toes the line between charming and overindulgent, and I think it really could have gone either way, but it managed to win people over by just being a fun experience, filled with a bunch of different themed levels, PlayStation-centric collectibles, and little gimmicks that brought out the uniqueness of the PS5 controller in ways that felt legitimately impressive. The connection it had to the broader ecosystem of PlayStation had also been expanded here, not only showing off the new technology that you were currently playing with, but also celebrating PlayStation's history from consoles to characters. This kind of brought on a full circle moment for the series, one that was originally designed as a playful standalone concept to show what PlayStation was in the current day, and ended up housing the entire legacy of PlayStation under one banner. A year after Astro's Playroom, it was announced that Sony's Japan studio would actually be shuttering and reconstructing, with employees either getting the boot or joining Astrobot dev Team Asobi, which until that point had just been one dev team under Japan studio. The announcement was a bit of a tough one because while it was obvious that PlayStation's plans were to explore the Astrobot IP further and really use it as the core of their brand for the foreseeable future, it also meant that studios that brought us Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and Gravity Rush, not to mention providing support for Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Bloodborne, had now become defunct. The closure of Japan studio is well documented, and I encourage you to look into it further. It was a huge part of the games industry for decades, and it gives the popularity of Astrobot a bit of a bittersweet edge. But the promise of a shifted focus to that franchise did in fact come true not long after. Astrobot 2024 is the first full-length game in the franchise that's playable on normal consoles, despite being the 5th appearance for the character and the 3rd game named after him. And you can see how each iteration of this idea built on the last one for us to end up with one of the most polished and enjoyable 3D platformers in a long time. I think what's great about this franchise is that it can be its own fun experience, full of detail and fun abilities and things that make it enjoyable as a standalone game, but it's also an active and ongoing celebration of everything PlayStation, even some of the lesser known or forgotten characters. Some people do view it as a vapid, meta promotional tool for Sony, but I think it's too well produced and enjoyable to completely disregard it like that. I mean, the enemies on the beach level wearing floaties is enough to give it Game of the Year by itself. As big of a fan as I am though, I'm also a little bit unsure how this franchise continues over time. We've seen all these different ideas from tech demos and VR games and mini entries come together to create something great that borrows heavily from what came before it. But if some of those same concepts are repeated for another full-length title, I don't think it'll be as positively received. The earlier games were clearly experiments, so Frankensteining them together and creating a heap of content around that is fine, but the level of overlap next time would need to be a lot less. The same goes for the character cameos. I love these guys, they're super fun to collect because you never know who's gonna show up, but that really loses its novelty once you've already collected this many characters once or even twice now. There is a limit to how much you can pull from the past, and even though I don't have any problems with how it's been handled until now, I think the character's next major appearance is gonna decide whether he can actually be the mascot PlayStation wants him to be, because he'll need to stand on his own a little more. However that ends up going though, it's still pretty incredible to see how a nameless side character placed in a tech demo for a camera could become the face of the biggest gaming company in the world in just a few short years. Anyways, subscribe for more video essay speedruns, check out my main channel as well, it's on the screen right now, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!